Hello and welcome. Few would defend the wild disparities in wealth in the world today, and most people support equality of opportunity. But while societies have tried to level the playing field, the rich are getting richer, while the children of poor families struggle to improve their situation. And it's not just the billionaires. The huge increase in property prices, 20-fold in the last 50 years, have entrenched wealth and opportunity across a swathe of middle-class households, while making it harder for the underprivileged to escape poverty. If we want to reduce inequality, do we have to take a much more radical approach to inheritance? Why should we allow inheritance at all? Is it just a means of embedding privilege in those who already have profound advantages? Or is it a fundamental human right to be able to pass on wealth to our children, and would its denial undermine the very fabric of society and motivation to succeed? Well, to discuss this, let's talk to our speakers. Let's introduce our speakers. David Aaronovitch is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and has a regular column in The Times. He was previously president of the National Union of Students and a communist, but now identifies as a radical moderate. That's the new Taliban or something like that. Different sort of radical moderation, no doubt. Paul Mason is a British commentator and radio personality, and was previously economics editor for the UK's Channel 4 News. A former member of the Radical Workers' Power Group, Paul describes his politics as now very complicated. And Polly Mackenzie is chief executive of Britain's leading cross-party think tank, Demos. I bet that makes the second leading one very cross when you say that, Polly. She previously worked as a business journalist and director of policy to the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, from 2010 to 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel. Now, in proper How the Light Gets In style, we're going to give each of our speakers 3 minutes, uninterrupted, the last time you'll be uninterrupted during this session, I suspect, to put forward their position on this question. Is inheritance simply a means of embedding privilege in those who have profound advantages already? And to start us off, David.
The simple answer to that is, of course, yes. And we all know it is. And we all know the things that we do, especially when we're parents, to try and do things for our children, which, if other parents don't do them in quite the same way or can't do them in quite the same way, have the effect of embedding a degree of privilege in our children. One of the things that's really, my children, my oldest is over 30 now, my youngest is 24. They went to 3 different types of schools, and I saw every kind of middle-class gaming of the school system that you can possibly imagine, together with every possible reason given for doing it. Right down to the very left-wing American journalist who took his son out of our daughter's primary school on the basis that Labour's policy for schools meant that they couldn't provide a proper education for a child as bright as his was. And as you can imagine, the rest of the parents took this extremely. So I think I've seen it in kind of every form that it exists. And yet, British people are incredibly edgy about the question of drawing a line between, if you like, what is a privilege that you might not want people passing on, and a privilege or a set of circumstances, expectations that you might want them passing on. And the reason why I'm looking at my phone now is that I did take a look before I came out at something that happened in the very early premiership of Gordon Brown. You may remember, those of you who are antiques, that Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair and then thought, well, maybe I'll have an election. Seems like a good time to have an election. And then the whole issue of inheritance tax came up, which was an extraordinary kind of thing. And George Osborne said this, and this is how he's reporting in The Guardian in October 2007. Mr. Osborne said that inheritance tax fell increasingly, in quotes, on the aspirations of ordinary people, with over a third of homeowners now having it hanging over them. To loud cheers and applause, I think we can gather from context this is the Conservative Party conference, he said, the next Conservative government will raise the inheritance tax threshold to £1 million. So you'd have to have £1 million worth of inheritance before you paid tax on it. Taken together, our measures on stamp duty and inheritance tax represent the most important reform of capital taxes for a generation. We will take 10 million people out of these taxes on aspiration, and so on. So he cast the question as being a matter of aspiration, despite the fact that the vast majority of people would never get close to passing on that amount of money, or if they did, the tax on it would be neutral because the amount would be only just over the threshold and so on. And yet, that turned, or people felt that turned the polls sufficiently for Gordon Brown at that point to suddenly say, well, maybe I won't have an election after all, which turned into something like a catastrophic mistake. My own view is that I would like to see very hefty inheritance taxes. I don't think, just as I like to see significant taxes on all forms of unearned wealth, so that you aren't able simply to take with you an advantage simply as a consequence of your birth or your parental preference, your parents' preferences with you into the next stage of life. But, and I'll stop in a moment, that is only a very, very tiny bit of what is a very, very much bigger picture about what constitutes inheritance and also the part that inheritance plays in what we might call inequality.
Thanks, David, and we will be going on to many of those points shortly. And of course, I think many of us here in the UK will also be thinking about the current debate about social care and inheritance and how that comes to. I'm sure that will come up later in the debate. Let's turn, though, for the next take on that question. And a reminder, is inheritance simply a means of embedding privilege in those who have profound advantages already? Paul Mason, can I turn to you?
Yes, and hello, everybody. It's nice to be in a live tent, isn't it? We live in a kind of capitalism that has turned out to be very good at raising inequality and widening inequality, both income inequality, but what we're talking about now is wealth. And as I spent my time as an economics editor, one should always explain income is like sort of people's profits and wages and even rents. Wealth is what they have in the bank and the shares they own and the houses and luxury flats and Lamborghinis they own. Okay, so it's stuff. Income inequality is widened. Wealth inequality, however, in this country is off the scale. The bottom 50% of us, and I would probably think that most people in this, well turned out though many of you look, and this is North London, you are probably still in the bottom 50%, many of you. We together own 9% of society's wealth. Now, what's the problem with that? Income, at least, is contestable. There is always, and has been in my lifetime, a struggle between working people and bosses over who gets the slice of the pie. You can go on strike for higher wages. In our lifetime, the profit share of GDP has risen and the wages share has shrunk, but not actually by a massive amount, 2 or 3 percentage points. Wealth is different. It's very difficult to struggle over wealth and indeed over the power that it gives people. So I'm no big advocate of the John Rawls theory of social justice. I see it in a way as one of the ideological sort of justifiers of the society we live in. But if you do use that yardstick, Rawls says, under what circumstances should we tolerate inequality? And he says, well, one of them is that the least off gain the most from it. I'm afraid I cannot see the current situation conforming to that in any way. During the pandemic, 650 billionaires in the world, their wealth rose from $3 trillion to $4 trillion through doing what? Nothing. So what do? Actually, if you look at inheritance tax, you could expand it. At the last election, John McDonnell, Labour's left, shadow chancellor, only really promised to reverse George Osborne's cut. It would bring in about 700 million. We need billions to transform society, to redress inequality, to sort out climate change. Billions upon billions upon billions. And for that reason, what I favour is an in-life tax rather than the inheritance tax, an in-life tax on the size of wealth. And Thomas Piketty, for example, who is one of the key academics who studies the sources of inequality, believes that everything above $1 billion, you should simply take 90% of it away from people. That's the kind of redistribution I would like to see. And against that, IHT is a little bit of a drop in the ocean.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. And we will no doubt, I think, return to many of those issues in the wider discussion. But last take on this first question, is inheritance simply a means of embedding privilege in those who have profound advantages already? Polly.
Thank you. It was really brilliant to see when Paul mentioned taking 90% of the assets away from billionaires. Quite a lot of sort of Churchill dog nodding occurring in the audience. And there's always a danger with an event like this, right? That we all point at a bad thing and nod wisely and say, yeah, that's bad, but can't actually come up with a way of resolving it or navigating it. It seems to me it's very clear that inheritance, along with the other thing that David has mentioned, education, is one of the key mechanisms for the transfer of inequality between generations. It's one of the absolutely fundamental things we do. Perhaps the third is genetics, but it's quite hard to think of a government policy that changes that one. So we can imagine a government that uses education policy to try and level up, as the saying goes. And then you've got to do something about this transition of assets between people. But the problem is, lots of people in lots of tents like this have said that, and yet what we've got in our politics is George Osborne talking about an inheritance tax that most people won't pay and causing real, lasting ripple effect through our politics as a result of it. So something must be wrong, right? Because if you ask people, what should we tax? Should we tax unearned wealth or should we tax income? The vast majority of people are really clear, unearned wealth. We shouldn't be taxing income so much. You can get people on left and right enthusiastic about that. The thing is, that conflicts against a value system people have around inheritance that says actually often inheritance isn't unearned wealth. It's unearned by me if my mum dies and gives me a house, right? Of course. But my mum worked her whole life to build up that asset. There's a whole thing about housing assets where actually a lot of the gain has come from our stupid Ponzi scheme housing market, but that's another event, not one that's on today, but I talk about it a lot. But that fundamental thing of it doesn't feel like unearned wealth in the way that connects into the sort of billionaires thing about Jeff Bezos and how much we'd like to take 90% of his wealth away. There's something going on in our value system about the idea that you should work hard, and we encourage people to make savings, right, in their life. It's sort of active government policy to encourage people to save for a rainy day, to put aside money to protect themselves for their pension in retirement so that they can have an income and not fall back on the state. We encourage people to go into home ownership so they don't have to rent or fall back on housing benefit. So we've got a whole value system that says you should be working hard to accumulate financial resilience around yourself and around your family. If you look at people who experience a financial shock, one of the top 3 things that causes a financial shock is an emergency loan to somebody else in your family or friendship network who's experienced a financial shock. Because that's what we do, we're nice to each other. So for me, and we'll get on to talking about it, I think, we need to think about what can we do that actually connects into the value system that is driving people instead of just pointing at wealth inequality and saying that's a bad thing we can't do anything about. And for me, it starts with understanding that one of the worst things that happens around the transition of wealth going forward the next 15 years is that it is going from 85, 90-year-olds to 60, 65-year-olds. So you're not transferring assets to the young generation who are going to start business and do things, or even help their kids or tackle education. All you're doing is circulating money among retired people. And I love retired people. They can be great. Lots of you look like you might be retired. But we should aim higher. And for me, that starts by 2 things: finding ways to get people to give money to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and finding a way to let retired people spend a lot more money having a lot more fun.
Thanks very much indeed, Polly. That sounds like a manifesto we can all get behind, I have to say. I just add, you said that genetics is not something that governments can do anything about. There were rumours that the government last year briefly had a special advisor who was very interested in questions of eugenics, but I think that was during a different period in government from your own, and perhaps thankfully so.
I think he also wanted everyone to take this intelligence pill.
Right. And where are they available? No, okay, we'll get to that later on. So thank you all our pitchers for the first set of views on this question of equality and how it relates to inheritance. And I want to separate the 2 things out just a little bit as we carry on the discussion. Let's talk about equality first, because we've heard a lot of language, particularly here in the UK, in the last year or so, year and a half, particularly as people are coming out of the pandemic, about levelling up, opportunity for all, making sure that we get better outcomes. But all the figures show that equality certainly hasn't yet been achieved, even if that's supposed to be the end goal. And I wonder if the question is partly based on a false assumption, an assumption perhaps which is a kind of intellectual dishonesty, that we want to believe that we want to be equal, but the reality of what it means actually makes us step away. In other words, are we really in favour of full equality? David, what would you say?
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.